If something with your partner really annoys you, do you confront them in public? That's going to make everything worse, I think. But that's exactly what Western politicians are doing with countries like China. Why? I'm glad that you could join us for Asia Talk here in Beijing's art district, Jijiaoba 798. China, partner or rival, that's our question today. And one thing is certain, we must care more about this country. This emerging power has, especially since the economic crisis, become the consumer market of tomorrow for Germany. China is booming right now like no other country, and our economy, as you know, is based on export. So do we have to learn to deal differently with China? This is a question that no one is better posed to answer than one of the most respected German diplomats. Warm welcome to the ambassador to China, Dr. Michael Schaefer.
Hello, Frank. Nice to see you again.
Pleasure. Yes, you have quite a career behind you as a German diplomat. You held posts with the UN in New York, in Singapore. You was posted for quite a long time. You also worked with the UN in Geneva as a German representative on the Human Rights Commission. And for years you worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs under Joschka Fischer and later under Frank-Walter Steinmeier as a political director. The political director is the person who really keeps the things going and is often sent to broker all important international negotiations. And now since 2 years, you are German ambassador in Beijing. This is one of the most interesting ambassador posts. And again, you have no time to rest. So is China our partner or is it our rival?
Well, I think if you look into a long-term perspective, China clearly is a partner to Germany, is a partner to Europe, is a partner to the Western world. There's no doubt China in 10, 15, 20 years will be one of the most powerful economic countries in the world.
So is Germany big enough to be a partner?
Well, Germany alone certainly would not be a country that, let's say, in the middle of the century would be capable of solving many of the international issues all by itself. I think it is very important for all European countries, larger or smaller countries, to form a European Union which will find its own place as one of the big players in the world, together with the US, with China, Japan, and some of the newly arising new economic power.
But it's still a problem for many European countries to speak with one voice towards China. And then the Chinese can sometimes deal with one country, sometimes they deal with another country. That's not how it should be.
Well, I mean, Europe is work in progress. It has been work in progress since the 50s. We have had the same phenomenon at each of the stages when Europe enlarged, when we were trying to deepen the European Union. And then I think Europe will be in a different shape. It will speak in terms of foreign policy issues more with one voice than we have done before. And that is very necessary in dealing with important partners like China and others.
Do we have to deal with China in a different way as it becomes more and more important?
Well, I mean, frankly speaking, China has already, in the last 10 years, taken a development which has made it a key partner in international organizations like the United Nations, in the political field as a permanent member of the Security Council, in the World Bank context, in the WTO. And it was a very important step that China joined the WTO and accepted the international rules of trade. I think with all these steps, China has already become an enormously decisive element in the international decision-making process.
In which way we have to deal differently with China? What do we have to learn? What's going wrong?
I mean, first of all, every country is different. We see this in Europe. Dealing with a Scandinavian partner is different than dealing with one of the Mediterranean ones. The same is true, obviously, in the global scene, dealing with an Asian country with all its long history, its culture, its society developments, which are considerably different than ours, of course, make a partner a different one.
So in which way we have to change our attitude towards China? What do we still have to learn?
Well, I think what we need to do is try to look at China in as realistic a way as possible. I remember 10 years ago there was a China euphoria in Germany. And if you look at the stage of development 10 years ago, I would say it has taken a quantum leap since the 1990s compared to today. And obviously, a country of this size, of this magnitude, of the population of 1.3 billion people, of the enormous gaps between cities and urban areas and rural areas on the other side, there are discongruencies in its development. And we tend to look at particular specific issues in such a development phase.
Can you give an example?
Well, for instance, if you look at the question of poverty, you could say China probably has had the most successful development in the last 30 years compared to any other of the developing countries in the world. And it has done so more or less out of its own power.
But still,
if I just say what the difference is, development for 1.3 billion people. But if you then compare it to the gap between the urban and the rural population, you would say that it is an unacceptable wide gap. So it depends on if you look at, is the glass half full or is it half empty? It depends on the eyes of the beholder.
Is the glass half full or is it half empty?
Well, certainly I would think it's half full, and I'm quite confident that this development is continues to go into the right direction, irrespective of the more critical elements in the development of the society, which we all know, and which lie obviously in the opening process of this society.
But the Chinese government decided not to open all areas of development in the same way. The economic openness is much further developed than the political, than the human rights. So is this a good strategy?
Well, I mean, if you look at the development of most societies, there have never been really parallel developments. You always have congruencies and discongruencies. And my personal feeling is obviously opening China up to the world market, making it a marketplace itself, adjusting to the international rules of the world market, of course, implied a much quicker opening in the economic sphere. The society, obviously, if you compare it to our European societies, has grown relatively slowly out of an historic era which was characterized by a total locking process. The Cultural Revolution has offered no personal or collective freedoms whatsoever. And if you compare the time at the end of the 1970s with the society as it stands today, I think you would agree that the individual space for the normal Chinese has never been larger before.
But again, a but, because the way China is dealing with Xinjiang, the way China is dealing with Tibet is not according to our ideas of dealing with minorities. What shall we do? Should we press China more openly to change this policy? Should we impose sanctions?
Well, first of all, I agree with you with the assessment that there are grave deficiencies in certain areas. One relates to the area of individual human rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, things which we have taken, let's say, 100 years to develop in our societies. Let's not forget that. On the other hand, you have a society which consists of a huge minority, the Han population, the Chinese population, and then you have 56 minorities. Now, all in all, if you now look into the social structure of China, you will see enormous differences how minority policies work. It does not work really well in the areas which are at the fringes of the Chinese empire.
And there's a mix between religion and politics, which is a problem as well.
Well,
in some minorities.
I wouldn't accept that argument in toto. They are related arguments. If you take, for instance, the Tibetans. In Tibet, the key conflict is that on one hand, the Chinese government, and by the way, the majority of the Chinese people, is afraid that Tibet would drift away from the Chinese society, which would mean that it would separate at one point and break the unity of the Chinese society. On the other hand, you have a position in which the Tibetan peoples want to have more freedom in terms of religious autonomy, in terms of their cultural freedoms, things which we
But for the Western countries, it's quite important to have a separation between religion and government, state affairs. And in countries like, or in provinces like Tibet and Xinjiang, this is all mixed and is causing a lot of problems.
Well, I think it's more mixed because we tend to mingle all the different factors which are complicating the situation. One thing is clear, and that is part of the Chinese constitution. Tibet belongs to China in terms of a unitary state. That's why Germany and the European Union and all other countries are saying we pursue a one China policy, which means the territorial integrity and the political sovereignty of China is untouched. We support this quest by China. On the other hand, a level below, we support the quest of all people everywhere in the world to have within the political context of the state more space for their own religious and cultural development.
How can we press China to change?
Well, I don't think it's a question of pressing any country. I think we are not in a position, certainly not us Germans with our recent history, to tell everybody in a paternalistic way what to do or what not to do. But I think it's quite important and interesting for our Chinese interlocutors to understand why in our historical development, after the breakdown, after the end of the Second World War, it was so important to realize the respect for human rights in our society, because it was the key for developing a harmonious society in Germany.
But do they want to understand? Do they really care about this?
Well, I think they're interested in understanding why the development in Germany and in large parts of Europe has been so successful. Yes, that does not mean that they would be ready, so to say, one-on-one to implement the same kind of policies that we have pursued. But I think what the Chinese are doing is they are open to learn from good experiences and to learn from rather negative experiences. And they feel that they need a social fabric in China which allows for minorities to live side by side with each other and not to be in conflict.
This sounds like a strategy you do behind closed doors. Is this right? Should we not openly raise our voices politically?
Well, we do raise our voices openly. I think there are many people on all sides who have a straightforward dialogue with all parts of the society, the political leadership, the institutions. But I think it ought to be done in a way where we do not necessarily raise our finger and do it in a paternalistic way, as I said. It's a way of treating your partner with respect. And I think it's an experience which we have when we talk to friends or to our children or to people that we may have an argument with. The moment we try to enforce our own view, which may be right, which may not be right, then you force somebody else into a defensive position and try to marginalize him. I think it's much better to invite the other side into a dialogue which is at eye level, which is, so to say, a dialogue with respect, which does not mean that you do not exchange very open and clear positions.
But do they respect us? If you look at the area of intellectual properties, I get the impression that they do what they can do, and they don't care if we suffer, if middle-sized German companies are suffering because they invested a lot of money in developing these new products.
I don't think that's right. If you look at the cases which we see in courts, 5 years ago, China did not have really a law on intellectual property. After they joined the WTO, they have very quickly put up a law, I think, which stands at the same level with all the necessary international standards with European or American laws. Where we see a problem is the implementation of such a law into the widespread areas of the Chinese market.
Is this a technical problem, or is it a problem that they don't really want to implement those laws because they are better off if they just take the products?
It's a good question. I couldn't say yes or no. I think it is a technical and a political problem. I would think there is a political resolve at the level of the central Chinese government to really implement effectively such a law. But if you look down into a country which has huge provinces and which has thousands of municipalities, and where political decision makers, so to say, have to take their own decisions at the municipal level, you will always find that there are discrepancies between, so to say, what the...
It's a big mess.
Well, you can call it mess. You can also call it a process which has not yet been effectively implemented in all parts of China. I would agree with that, totally, because we have quite a number...
The words diplomats use.
Well, I would think the process is leading into the right direction again, but it's insufficient. There are many cases in which German, European companies suffer from infringes on intellectual property, but I think the cases are such that there are more and more cases which are taken up by courts and where even German companies have successfly fought for their intellectual property.
I can really see that you are fascinated with your job here, being ambassador in China. Why did you come, or why did you decide to come to China? You could have decided to have a nice posting in, let's say, Paris or London.
Well, I think it's obvious that at this point in time, there seems to me no other country in the world which has such a fascination. There is a dynamism in not only in the economy, but also in the development of the society as here in China. There is a perspective of a development which will make China in the next 30, 40 years either a big positive world power, world actor, or a country which will have enormous difficulties in facing the global issues which we have to tackle, and that is climate change, environmental protection, and economic growth.
So what is personally fascinating if you live in China?
Well, the first thing that fascinates you is the diversity of the people. There is not one Chinese people, there is not one Chinese mind. Of course, 1.3 billion people have a diversity if you go from the northeast to the southwest and then to the provinces farther west, which couldn't be more different. It is a continent. It is a huge society, coupled with the cultural and historic processes that this country has seen over the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. You can feel that there is a host of knowledge, wisdom, of traditions, which I think are admirable.
As a young man, you went to study or for an exchange to America. If you would be in the same position today, would you go to China? And why?
Well, I mean, first of all, again, there is no time which could be measured with the same parameters. In the 60s, for us, America was the country to go to because we could learn a lot. Today, it is still very important, still very interesting for young people to have the American experience. But at the same time, there is a new center of power developing in Asia. And at the middle, at the center of this new center of power, I'm sure, is China.
What can we learn from China?
Well, I think many things we can learn, although there is no way of copying a society. What we, for instance, can learn is the patience that even ordinary people have in looking at the solution of certain problems. We can learn from that patience the more long-term strategic perspective. The strategies and the strategists in our countries obviously try to have that same kind of long-term view. If I follow the climate change discussion in the federal government, in our federal parliament, that is the perspective most people are taking. And I think we have, that's why we have a congruence of interest, for instance, with countries like China, because we can say in 2050, that's where we want to be. How we get there may be an issue of national policies. And here, I think the Europeans have started to put their act together. They have formulated certain obligations which they're ready to accept. And I think China, India, and other newly industrialized countries are trying to formulate their own perspective as to how to meet the same long-term requirements. It's quite a bit of work, but I'm not pessimistic that this may not happen. I think everyone understands the urgency of the problem, but I think we also have to respect that we have a common responsibility, but can have a differentiated approach in meeting those responsibilities.
What are you not liking if you look at China?
Well, I mean, frankly speaking, if you have a country of the size and success of China, looking back the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, I would hope that they could be a bit more relaxed in dealing with criticism from the outside world. I think they should not react in the way they sometimes do. most of the criticism is meant to be constructive. We also are open in our European societies for criticism. There's no country without flaws, and I think that is something that I would wish China eventually accepts and learns, that they deal in the international context with a more relaxed attitude, accepting not only shoulder patting for the successes they have, but also a bit of constructive criticism regarding areas in which homework still will have to be done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. We're running out of time. We could talk quite a bit about China, but probably the next time. And don't forget, as the Chinese are saying, 慢走, walk slowly.